Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Our guest today is Ron Duren. Ron is the founder of Forging Mettle and host of the popular Forging Mettle podcast. He specializes in developing mental toughness and, in fact, is a licensed user stroke facilitator of the MTQ psychometric assessment. He will show you how to take control of your mental game and unlock your inner warrior. The term forging mettle, metal is spelt M-E-T-T-L-E, gives you an insight into Ron's background. Ron is an engineer who's developed some wonderful expertise around leadership, performance, and resilience. And he has a most eclectic and interesting range of interests and influences. We could easily do a podcast on each. He is firstly Assistant Professor for Leadership and Management for the Engineering Management Program at the University of Colorado Boulder in the US. And interestingly, holds 4 engineering patents to his name. When he isn't doing this, Ron is a performance coach, an aerobatic pilot, an Ironman triathlete, and an ultra runner. And if that wasn't enough, he's also spent 30 years of his life playing baseball, much of it at a semi-professional level. He brings all of this together in his work with Forging Mettle. At its heart, there is a belief that to be uncommon, we must train ourselves to do hard things, to do what others want. This is going to be a great discussion. Welcome, Ron.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I tell you, you sure do make me sound impressive.
Well, you make me feel inadequate, Ron.
It's all smoke and mirrors, all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. Well, I think it might be useful just to start, Ron, with what took you to looking at mental toughness and, the ideas around mental toughness?
Oh, it's a great place to start. I feel like it was a journey that started, gosh, let me think, about 9 years ago. I woke up, and this is a common story, right? I woke up one day and said, is this it? Is this my life? Is this what I do till I die, right? I didn't feel like I was making an impact on the world. I think as a younger man, I was much more mentally tough, more mentally and physically tough. And as I kind of aged, I feel like I got soft. And I didn't think I thought it was leading to my lack of fulfillment in life. And turns out I was right, because I went down this crazy path of, I started doing Ironman triathlons. That led me to ultra running and doing things like running 50-mile races, signing up for 100-mile races, all of that with the idea of I want to increase my mental toughness. So it really started with this idea of that. And then it was just this amazing thing that it's almost a paradoxical, it's a paradigm shifting thing that the more you do hard things, the more you enjoy your life, the more fulfilled you are. And so it was this light bulb moment for me that I had spent a good 20 years of my life always trying to avoid hard things. I was a world champion at taking the path of least resistance. And I didn't realize how much that was detrimental to my well-being. And so, again, when I try to tell people, hey, you need to do hard things, they go, well, wait a minute, Ron, I already have a hard life. I don't want to do more hard things. I want less hard things. And I go, you're missing the point here. Really doing hard things makes your life easier. So I started down this path, and then I just started, I got in touch with AQR and you, Doug, and got certified in the MTQ. And just really started digging into it and studying mental toughness. I really do gravitate toward the 4 C's model. I've looked at quite a few researchers in mental toughness, and the 4Cs model really just kind of, it works for me. There's a lot of good stuff there that I like, and so that's how I arrived here. There's much more to it than that, but that's maybe the short answer.
Yeah, love that. What a great way to kind of get an interest in mental toughness, and I think that actually shows why you've kind of grasped it really well, because your introduction to the concept was proactive, right? And a lot of the old resilience theories from the 1970s onwards were always this kind of reactive. It was kind of like bad stuff happens and I have to dig through it, grind through it. And that's the kind of being exposed to hard stuff that you don't necessarily want to be exposed to, versus your idea there of going, is this it? Like, and proactively go out there and find some hard stuff that, yeah, it's hard, but it's enjoyable, or you've got an ability for it, or something like that. And then you can kind of see this like virtuous cycle developing there. Yeah, I go find something that I can't currently do, but I'm interested in giving it a go. And then you think, well, now I've done that, I know I can do that. Geez, where do my limits actually lie? Like, maybe I can do other stuff. And so it's such a great story for an interest to it. And I can completely see why then that kind of proactivity means that you kind of vibe with it.
Yeah, well said. You know, the idea of, you know, the research will say that adversity that we don't see coming, or we don't adversity that visits us is the more stressful, right? The adversity that we take on, that we have a choice in, is less stressful. And you say, okay, well, why do that? And I think you hit the nail right on the head, John. Is I always like to say, I've spent 10, 12 hours on a bicycle saddle, that seat, we often call it a saddle. I've done 100 plus mile rides on that. And I always say, if I can sit on that seat for 12 hours, there is no airline seat that will be uncomfortable to me ever again. So yeah. You choose that adversity. And I think you said it well, John, is you start to learn what you're capable of. And what I said earlier is doing hard things makes your life easier. There's nothing that's going to happen in my job, you know, my day-to-day job. There's nothing that's going to happen there that I haven't seen much worse in an ultra run, or in an Ironman, or, you know, whatever it may be, because I've taken on those things and I've kind of hardened myself to say, well, those little things don't even faze me anymore. And so I think that's at the heart of this idea of building mental toughness, and why it's going to lead to a better, easier life.
100%.
The way you describe that, Ron, it's you're in a sense you're talking about conquering your fear, or you know, dealing with something that you would normally find very hard or frightening. Is there room, do you think, for not necessarily conquering your fear, but learning to manage your fear? Is that an aspect of mental toughness in your book?
Oh, absolutely. One thing I would say, what I teach is, I don't like the idea of I'm fearless, right? Or no fear. Fear is a wonderful tool. Fear is not the enemy. Fear is something we should embrace. And I think you hit on a good point there, Doug, is learn to manage it. I don't like the word control. Don't try to control your fear. It's way too powerful. And so managing that fear is where I think that you kind of want to be. But absolutely. A previous version of me would not have taken on these big challenges. And I will tell you, I do a stretch goal every year. I do at least one stretch goal every year. And when I talk about a stretch goal, I'm talking about something that scares me. All right. I'm not afraid to say it scares me. I have no idea if I can pull this off. I don't know how this is going to be painful. This is going to be hard. But I do that, and I face that fear, and I walk into that fear again, because I've trained myself, and this is how I train people that I work with. Is don't look at that as I need to avoid fear. Embrace it, because that fear, that's just arousal, right? And that arousal actually will, I don't really like the word rise to the challenge, but it will help us rise to the challenge. And so I think at the heart of what you said, Doug, is I think a lot of people need a little help with facing those fears. And also, I think they don't give themselves enough credit for how powerful they are. I know that sounds cheesy, but I work with people and I always say to them, and sometimes people get offended by this, but I go, you don't know what you're capable of yet. All right. I would say 98% of the population really hasn't gone out there and pushed those limits to see what they're capable of. And that was me until I was 45 years old. So I get it. I'm not judging. I'm just saying that once you start to unlock that, wow, a whole world kind of opens up. And I think John was kind of getting at this. Once you do something, you go, wow, I can't believe I just did that.
Yeah.
And then you think, what else can I do? And then it just builds on itself. And then one day you look back 5 years and you go, I'm doing things that I never would have imagined I could do now. And so that's the beauty of this. And you can tell maybe by my voice that I get passionate about this, because when I see people unlock that, that's a cool thing.
Yeah. Very, 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 very cool thing. And I like the way you kind of explain it there, just that sense of where, like, I'm thinking, well, where does that belief come from? Like what you can achieve? Because sure, when you're working as an engineer and you're always taking the path of least resistance, that belief in what you're able to do, what you're capable of, like, isn't that just a guess? Like, you don't know, because it's not actually a knowable thing. So you kind of just take a guess. And I'm always kind of the opinion that there's probably an evolutionary advantage towards, taking the easy option. You probably survive more and pass on your genes more regularly and stuff like that. So yeah, like that, we all have this, whether it's a sort of articulated sense of what we're capable of, or just an intuitive that we've never really tuned into, but a sense of what you're capable of. And you think, well, where does that actually come from? Like, is it not just a guess that is almost certainly going to be wrong? Like,
well, that's a great question. I would push back a little bit and say, are evolutionary, from an evolutionary standpoint, I would certainly argue we're not built for being stagnant, for being, taking the easy path. Obviously we want to, the primitive part of our brain wants to move toward pleasure and away from pain, right? That makes sense. That, like, oh yeah, of course, I like pleasure, I don't like pain. That's fine. But for our ancestors, it was a survival situation. They had to find better shelter. They had to learn better. They had to create better hunting tools. They had to get better at hunting, maybe gathering food. So it was always this idea of let's do better, let's do better, let's do better, strive. And so I think that's what leads human beings to want to go over that next ridge and see what's in that next valley or whatever, the idea of adventure, and going out there and exploring. I do think that's kind of innate to us. Now, back to your question, John, how do we get that? How do we get that self-belief? There's a couple of things I'll bring up. I've interviewed several U.S. Navy SEALs on my podcast. And one of them, who was in the movie Act of Valor, Rook Denver, he said something along the lines of, he goes, in the SEAL teams, we have an irrational belief we can win. He said those words, irrational. And I go, well, wait a minute. But he also followed that up with, that's incredibly powerful. When you have a team of individuals that has an irrational belief they can win, that's incredibly powerful. It's that mindset, right? That I can do this an incredibly high level of self-belief. Now, of course, to them, they probably don't think it's irrational. They think this is not irrational, but he used that word, which I thought was intriguing. And to outside observers, it may look irrational, but to them, they go, yeah, we've trained to do this. We can do this. And so I think, back to your question, John, how do we get that self-belief? I think it comes from training. It comes from development. I just recently, here's an example. I had a podcast guest, and I would recommend that you guys reach out to Paula Reed if you don't know her don't have her on your radar. She was one of the editors of a brand new, first of its kind textbook called Adventure Psychology. All right. And so she was on my podcast, and she said, or later she asked me, she goes, do you want to contribute a chapter on enduring performance? I said, Paula, I go, I'm not a psychologist, right? I don't have a PhD. I'm not a psychologist. I go, why in the world would you be asking me to write something in a textbook? I mean, this isn't just, throw something out there, kind of a book. This is a textbook. And do you think I had an imposter syndrome? Do you think I had all kinds of doubt? Absolutely. Did I have to sit with that for a while before I said yes? You bet I did. And so, but here's the thing. I don't think I could have done that 7 or 8 years ago.
Right.
It's because I've built this life of doing hard things. I said, hey, I'm going to step into this. It's going to be hard and I'm going to have to learn a lot, but I can do this. And so I think the short answer to that, self-belief needs to be built. And closely related to that is confidence. Confidence is so powerful. Once you start to get confidence in what you can do, what you're capable of, the sky's the limit.
Well, you're in good company, Ron, because we actually outnumber John. I'm not a psychologist either. I'm a dumb economist.
Good for you. And there's people out there doing that, right? And so I would say don't limit yourself just because you don't have a psychology degree. If you're knowledgeable and you want to take on that challenge, you can do just like Doug and I do. Doug, I've listened to you and I've read your blog posts and there's, I don't know, you don't need a psychology degree. You're very knowledgeable about what you're talking about. And I teach in education. I mean, I teach in the university level education. So I'm a fan of that kind of education, but it's not the only way to get education. Just because somebody doesn't have a fancy degree doesn't necessarily mean they don't know what they're talking about.
I do have an advantage. I'm surrounded by people like John and Peter Clough and others, and you can't help but learn everything. I'm sucking all their knowledge out of them. Ron, sorry, John, I'll just interject because I love what you said earlier about your development journey. And I recognize that as a journey where people kind of learn to become more mentally tough. And in our work, we come across a wider range of people, some people who are much more mentally sensitive, who will find it very hard to become more mentally tough, even if they are exposed to experiences. And what we find with them, we will very often have to show them how to cope or understand their mental sensitivity and learn how to optimize who they are. They won't necessarily change. They won't necessarily go off and do this one big challenge a year. So do you come across that? And have you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Number one, let's start with this. I know this may not come across well for your audience, but I know that MTQ or not MTQ, but AQR, and really all the literature that you guys publish say, hey, if you're mentally sensitive, there's a place for you too. And I agree with that. But what I would push back and say is even the mentally sensitive, if they can if they can increase their mental toughness, it's a good thing. I don't think there's anybody out there that increasing their mental toughness up to a point would not be beneficial to them. So I would start with that. If you're mentally sensitive, that's great. There's a place for you. But I would also encourage that person to say, all right, can we just take it up? You don't need to be a Navy SEAL, but let's take it up a few notches and see if your life improves from increasing your mental toughness. So I think I have a hard time believing that more mental toughness, again, within reason, is not a good thing. So I would start there. And then, one of the things that I say as a leadership coach and professor is, and this is cliche, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And these people, if you can't find a why for them, if they're mentally sensitive and you're saying, hey, I think, some mental toughness would be beneficial to you, but you can't convince them. And by the way, that's my job, to try to find a way to convince them that their life's going to be better. But if I can't get there, it's a losing proposition. They've got to want to do this. And so again, I'm trying to uncover that why for them or help them uncover it. But if we don't get there, then maybe that's not a client for me. So I think that's a tough thing. But here's what I would say. Let me just segue into this idea. I'm writing a book right now, and one of the things that I'm building on in this book is I interviewed Jim Loehr, kind of one of the forefathers of mental toughness. And we were talking about his first book on mental toughness. And this goes back a good 30, 35 years. And of course, much has changed around mental toughness. And I asked Jim, about his first book, and he goes, if I wrote that book now, Ron, he goes, it would be a much different book. It would be much more than just mental toughness. And that was, I had already been thinking about that idea. And that when he said that, I said, there's the light bulb moment. We need more than mental toughness. Mental toughness is, I have a hammer and everything's a nail, right? Mental toughness is great until it's not. Too much mental toughness can get us in trouble. We know this, right? You guys know this at AQR from all the research that you guys have done and reviewed. Too much mental toughness is not a good thing. We need to have self-awareness, situational awareness to know when I'm getting too far out there. And I would also say more is not always better, right? Mm-hmm. For most of us, we don't need to be, and I'm going to pick on some US guys here. You know, we don't, if your viewers or your listeners are familiar with David Goggins, you know, the former Navy SEAL that's making quite a name. He doesn't use the word mental toughness a lot, but that's really his game. But he's the guy that says, just suck it up, you know, don't be so weak. And it's very negative self-talk. And I feel like to be as tough as David Goggins doesn't do most of us any good. You know, we are not going to war. Most of us are going to be living our normal, regular lives. And I think that level of mental toughness just doesn't do anything for us. And so I would say the other thing that I don't like about that is I don't respond well to that. The drill sergeant approach to developing mental toughness is not going to work for me. Telling me to just suck it up, and I see a lot of mental toughness practitioners do that, doesn't work for me. So my book and my thoughts and I'm gonna, this first time I've put this out there, but I'm looking at mental toughness. I'm gonna call it humanistic mental toughness, kind of looking at the whole person. It's more than just being mentally tough. It's other things like learning to savor the small things in life, having self-compassion for yourself, having grace when you fall down and fail. You know, most of these things are not included in the mental toughness package. It leaves room for those bad days, right? And we all have them. None of us are perfect. And I think that mental toughness needs a little bit more of that humanity to it, right? Of most of the people that I'm going to work with are not Navy SEALs. They're, you know, they're moms and their dads, and it's beneficial for them to have mental toughness as well. But they don't look at it at the same level as some people do. And no judgment. If you're that person, you want to take it to an extreme level of mental toughness, have at it. If you think it's working well for you, great. But I think most people don't need that. And again, just to reemphasize, just add some humanity back into this idea of mental toughness. I want to encourage and empower people to develop mental toughness. I don't want to make them feel bad about themselves to develop mental toughness. And there's just a different approach there.
Yeah,
I think that's really. Oh, sorry, John. Go on.
No, I was going to say I think that approach is so pleasing to hear people say, because we get this kind of misconception of mental toughness, and like you say, when you start thinking about the other aspects of humanity that live alongside mental toughness, you know, it could be independent of it. So we know, for example, things around moral functioning and empathy and compassion and stuff like that, they're independent of mental toughness, in that you can be really mentally tough, and you might be a bit of a hard bastard and not very nice to people, or you might be really mentally tough and you can still be really compassionate and a lovely person. Equally, you could be mentally sensitive and you could be horrible, or you could be a really nice person. And I think sometimes people misinterpret it as this kind of bi-direction, as if, you know, you've got to be tough or nice. And you think, we know from empirical data that's not true. Those things are not connected in any way. For anyone who's a bit of a stats nerd, if you want the correlation, it's less than 0.01 between morality and mental toughness, between empathy and mental toughness. And actually, there's some aspects of respect for other people that's a small positive correlation. So I think it's such a positive way to view mental toughness as, like, our definition. We've always had that in part part that we have, you know, in part explains. So I think it's fantastic to to hear you thinking, rather than looking up at who do we kind of think of in this fairly crude way of being mentally tough, that's what we should aim to be like. But think, no, the average person, how do they develop the kind of mental toughness alongside other attributes that's going to make them a happier person, a well-functioning person, a person that's going to have a positive influence on the people around them?
Well said. Great add-on to what I just said. That's really where my mind is. What do you think, Doug? I mean, is this something that you agree with?
Absolutely. And I don't think there's any difference between us, and we have the same observations, but I guess we work with a whole range of people, and we totally agree that developing mental toughness, being more mentally tough, gives an advantage in most situations. As you say, too much mental toughness in some situations can be a bigger headache than being mentally sensitive. But generally, what you say is right. When we work with the more mentally sensitive, they tend to have two kinds of wants. They want, we have to deal with, do they want to be able to be more content? Do they want to be able to deal with life better? And the answer is yes. And then the other one is, do they really want to change? And very often they're frightened of that by virtue of their mental sensitivity. So our approach is really not to scare the mentally sensitive, if you see what I mean. And so when we're working with the more mentally sensitive, we paint a picture that they are who they are, and who they are can function. And we can help them to function by learning how to cope with the consequences of the mental sensitivity. But the curious thing about this, and it sounds very devious, but we didn't set out to be devious, is exactly the same tools and techniques work to help you to cope with life as they do to help you to deal with life. So when we talk, we will talk about positive thinking or visualization or anxiety control techniques. We'll introduce those for people who want to become more mentally tough, but we'll also introduce them to people who are mentally sensitive and want to deal with their mental sensitivity. And very often you find you've actually started them on a journey that they really want to go on, but we're frightened of going on. So in a sense, we have to learn to deal with the mindset of a mentally sensitive individual. It's harder to kind of, as you say, you can drag a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It's harder to drag them down that journey, but you can. And I think that's just what we've learned, that there's no point turning to a mentally sensitive individual and saying, get tough. That's the drill sergeant thing. It's, how do I help this person to become more effective? And I'm a great believer in contentment. How do you get them to become more content?
I mean, I think following up on what you were saying there, like was it Goggins, the guy? Is that essentially he's talking to an audience of people who probably already perceive themselves as mentally tough, in terms of, well, what is it? What impact are you actually having? Or is it that if you can preach to the converted, you go stand in a room and tell people who are actually like you anyway, and they just feel a bit, part of something, put an appendix there, see Jordan B. Peterson, anything, is anybody actually learning anything from what he spouts? Or is it people that already hold the same opinions as him that just feel that they've, had some sort of affirmation?
Yeah, I would agree. They have their tribe, right? They have their tribe. They're devoted, passionate followers. And by the way, I want to be very clear. I'm not really, this isn't meant to be a takedown of David Goggins. I've read his book, his first book. I loved it. It's not, there's some things in there I would disagree with, but for a lot of people, it's very helpful. But I think, John, you're hitting on the right point. It's the right person that's going to be drawn to somebody like David Goggins. And I feel like, in my humble opinion, that's probably a pretty small, when we look at the world population, I'm just spitballing something. I'll bet it's about 25% that might gravitate toward that. What happens to the other 75% that want to develop mental toughness? But David Goggins is not their model, right? They don't want that extreme mental toughness. They just want to improve their lives. That's kind of where I'm saying mental toughness for the rest of us, right? I'm not a special forces soldier, never going to be one. That's not what I'm shooting for. And I think that most people fall into that kind of category that I work with. Back to what Doug said. Number one, I absolutely agree. Start where you are. I think you need to meet people where they are, and there's no judgment behind where you are. We all have to start somewhere. So I think that's a good starting point. And then back to the idea of just empowering them. When you say, I believe in you, whenever you're working with somebody, that's an incredibly powerful thing. When it's coming from the right person in the right context, right? We just don't want to throw that around, but I think that's incredibly powerful. Say, I believe in you. I believe that you can become more mentally tough. And sometimes that's all they need to get past that fear that you were talking about, Doug, because they're going to have fear. And more than likely, they don't have the tools to deal with that fear yet. Right. And again, no judgment, because I used to be a guy that didn't know how to deal with fear either. And I would shy away from it. And so I've learned to, again, move toward that fear. And that's just been a lot of training and then having good positive results from it. If you move into fear and it always turns out bad, then you probably don't want to do that anymore. But I've had some good results that have really turned into, let's just say it, I'm living the best life I've ever lived. And I think most of that is because I go out there and I do hard things. So that's what I would say to that.